Hello, game changers. My name's Trina from Reimagine HR, and welcome to our panel discussion on HR breakthrough in 2022. I first want to acknowledge the Whadjuk Budja people of the Noongar Nation, which we are live streaming from today, which you would know as Perth, Australia. And we would like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging for the wisdom and the timeless culture that they bring to us. So welcome. Today we are having a conversation around 7 HR trends that may be facing us and HR in 2022. 7 just because it's a lucky number and it seemed like a good place to start, but we know that through the conversation that other things are going to pop up for us. So new to our digital event platform, we welcome you to the live stream. And if you're watching this later, welcome. For those that are live with us, you can chat amongst yourselves using the chat functionality that's on the platform. And we will be going into a Q&A session. So if you have questions that come up for you for the panel, things that you want to explore with us more, then please do raise those questions in the ask a question functionality below this screening. 2021 was the year really of reinventing HR and really cementing our role coming off the back of 2020, which really did shake things up. And 2022, from where I'm sitting, is an opportunity for us to start pushing the boundaries of the value that HR can add to organisations. And so something that we look at in a really structured way at Reimagine HR is following what trends and what insights are happening globally. The reality, though, is we have a lot of big research firms that put out a lot of trend insight reports. And I say to the game changers in my community that I sell my soul to subscribe to those things, so you might not have to. But we look forward to kind of bringing some of that curated content to you today and would love to know what you think and what's happening in your world. And so 7 trends that we're going to be looking at is, of course, we're going to be looking at hybrid work. We're going to be looking at virtual work, which seems to be here to stay, remote work, and all of the things that come with that in the time that we have. We'll also be looking at the talent war. You know, we talk about the great resignation. I called it for a while the great reshuffle, which I think it was always coming, and people moving out of cultures has always been on the cards and becoming more acute despite COVID-19 and the pandemic. But I think now it's going to be the sustained resignation. So my view is that that's where we are. And so we'll have a chat about the talent war and recruitment. We're also going to look at critical workforce skills and just touch base with our superstar HR leaders around what they're seeing in their space. And, what do those critical emerging skills look like for us? If we have visibility over them, is it a gap? Is it a blind spot? The 4th one we'll look at is, of course, going into employee wellbeing. We know that there's been a massive shift in terms of looking at mental health arising out of challenges with the pandemic. And that's become more broader in terms of our workforces needing more resilience and just wellbeing generally and the appetite for that. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. Diversity, equity and inclusion. So from where I'm sitting, DEI will be becoming an employer differentiator as we move forward. The expectation around people having cultures of belonging and where that fits is something that we can really kind of lean into, and not just because we want to be the best competitors, but because we want to create environments where people can be their best selves, because it's where the magic happens. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. We'll also talk about workforce data and analytics and all things digital. Not all things digital, because let's be honest, we might have 5 minutes to talk around some of these themes, but we'll be starting to explore kind of some of our observations. And then if you've got questions about it, we can do more of a deep dive before then looking and just having a quick chat around the role of HR, and upskilling HR and the change in our focus and what we think that looks like for us. And so we're very glad to have you with us. This is about exploring the world according to us. And I've got 4, there's 4 of us here to be able to contribute to that conversation, but I can sense already that we could probably do a deep dive into every single one of these trends and insights. So we'll see how we go in terms of our introduction. This is our first virtual event following the launch of our digital events platform. It's our business birthday today, so happy birthday to Reimagine HR. And every year we look to level up what we're doing to bring more to the HR community, to help expand thinking, to bring meaningful connections to HR professionals who are looking to do HR differently. So we have an appetite for new HR thinking. We want to create positive employee experiences, but we also want to have a really impactful role in terms of business outcomes. And so that's something that we explore a lot through our programs, and we're really glad to have conversations with you today. So I would like to share with you and introduce our three speakers who are joining me to talk all things HR on the trends that we've talked about. So we've got Marija Andacic, who's joined us. Marija's got a super strong background across a lot of functional areas. She leads a team in the care sector across all sorts of care, so aged care, youth care, disability care, the whole gamut, and also does a lot of work in terms of leadership and mentoring, and is a superstar in terms of wanting to give back in that space. So we welcome Marija when she's going to join us. Hanri Potgieter, she's going to give me some feedback on that in terms of my pronunciation, but Hanri is a very big advocate for progressing the HR function. She's got experience, internationally and from her time here in Australia, and brings some really unique insights into the space in terms of where she now finds herself in a more OD related space. And so that transition of HR into ODs a really great thing to explore, because those lines get blurred all the time. So love having conversations with Hanri. And finally, Matthew Thomas. So Matt has done lots of amazing things in terms of his time as a senior HR leader. In addition as well to giving back to our profession, is a real innovator and disruptor in terms of where he sees the role of digital in our space. Some of the work he's done in AI recruitment is really interesting, and you can talk to him about that at a different time. But really in terms of looking at how we can attract our talent and create experiences that matter. And, once people are in our organisation. So we're a diverse group. We're going to talk to you about the world according to us, and it would be great to get started. So a reminder to exchange any comments that you have amongst each other, and ask any questions of the panel in the ask a question function below. So I'd like to bring in our speakers. Hello, everyone.
Hi, Trina. Hi, everybody.
Welcome.
Morning.
Morning. I thought we'd get started in terms of talking about hybrid work. And so I'm keen to know what some of your thoughts are. And I might start with you, Matt, but around just what some of your observations have been, either in your organisation or anecdotally across your networks, kind of where you're seeing the hybrid work shifting or cementing this year.
Well, sorry, thank you, Trina. It's a really relevant topic for me, having only been week 6 in my new role with CommBank. And talking about hybrid, I'm sitting in an office, but half my team is actually based in Sydney and Melbourne, and a small part of the team's based in Perth. So whether we like it or not, hybrid is part of that sort of remit. And I think, as organisations, we have to adapt in regards to what's the best fit to drive business outcomes and drive good people outcomes in regards to, collaboration, thinking, all those types of things. So I think it's the first time I've had this experience, and I found it really quite rewarding, challenging, like a few 6 o'clock in the morning meetings just to keep in touch with the 3-hour difference on the East Coast. But when I think of hybrid, I think, the reality is the world has significantly changed over the last 2 years. And as businesses, we have to adapt to what that looks like, but one size fits doesn't work for everybody. I think where challenges may start to present in some organisations is that maybe the paradigm's gone too far and everyone's back in the workplace. Everyone's back at home, and businesses now want to start to bring employees back, and striking that balance between what's best from an employee perspective, but also at the same time what's best for a business perspective as well. And I've heard quite a few organisations where they've really kind of let the parameter go a little bit far, and now that's very hard to bring it back. It's almost become an entitlement, which, I know we're talking about this a bit later around talent. the reality is it is a key differentiator now in the sense of how people perceive future opportunities, not just driven by the previous sorts of shiny things around salary and career progression. Work-life balance and flexibility has become one of the key drivers for movement, I suppose, for employees. So I think it's here to stay. I think it's just about being realistic about what you can achieve in this space. And I think the success of those that have done it really well is not enforced it on people. It's been done through a collaboration piece and finding what best suits and plays to each strengths from a business and an employee perspective.
Yeah, because I've seen both, right? And across clients that I'm working with, I see the culture playing a big part in this as well. So I'm keen to know what Hanri and Marija's thoughts are. And that is that, so where we have constructive cultures which empower their workforce, have high levels of trust in their organisation, the hybrid remote work arrangements have seemed to work more positively than organisations coming from an insecurity space or a fear space where there's been more micromanagement. I've also seen some leaders, and certainly this is more across US data than Australia, and this is one of the things that we need to contextualise everything for ourselves. So we see what's out there, but we contextualise these trends for ourselves. And that is that there's some that are driving that mass return to the office, and some, I think, is a red herring of CEOs blaming hybrid work models for poor performance of their organisations in some regard. I think there's an element of a perception that people that do remote work are working multiple jobs. Who's got the time if you've got a family? I don't know who the people are that have all that time. But and I just guess that perceived loss of culture because people socially aren't in the workplace. So I don't know, Hanri, do you have any thoughts about that? And then Marija.
I think I'm going to just reiterate what Matt also said, that there isn't really a one-size-fits-all approach, and that every organisation really needs to put in the time to assess their dynamics and what they really want to achieve. I agree fully with you around how strong or healthy the culture is at the onset would have played a really big role in this. But people's needs have changed, so it's actually redefining what the organisation culture needs to be to create a positive employee experience and a positive culture, given a hybrid model is something that's going to stick around for quite a while. So it's almost redefining the culture that we want to have and what is the employee experience that we want to leave, taking into consideration that business still needs to happen as well. So it's almost creating a new culture that really meets both ends of the stick. At the end of the day, I don't think it's that clearly defined really for anybody.
Yeah. What do you think, Marija?
I think there's some challenges, for example, for our workforce where we are in the care sector and it is about providing that service face-to-face. It's a bit hard to be a carer and do it from home.
Yeah.
I think
counterintuitive.
Yeah. And I guess in terms of your culture space, you touched on one of the biggest, I think, issues that I'm finding across not just our business, it's certainly across other businesses and other HR professionals that I speak to, is the trust factor. And it's trusting your team and trusting your people that you're looking after to do the work that they've been engaged to do. Now, whether they do that in the 8 hours or whether they do it in the 6 hours, because ordinarily they would be spending 2 hours travelling to and from the office. At the end of the day, for example, for my team, we're doing a bit of a hybrid of working from home and also being in the office. And at the end of the day, I don't look at their work. It just gets done. And it's creating that trust and it's empowering them to actually take ownership of what they do and how they do it. And if they've got questions, they'll just ask for it. How do you build trust? It's one of those things where I feel like trust is given until it's not. And that's how I work. I'm trusting you to do your job. And if you don't do it, then we'll have another conversation about it. The flip side to that is the haves and have-nots. We've got our corporate services and some of our outlier offices that have the capability to work from home. And, we've been equipped with laptops and screens and anything else that you need to do to be able to do that. And then you've got the have-nots who are working in our early learning centres and our residential aged care and out in the community and, providing support to our family and children who can't work from home, who would love to. So the bigger issue for us is not so much how do we support the people that are working from home, but how do we also support those people that feel like, well, hang on, that's not fair. Why do you get to work from it and I don't? And, how do you manage that?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you. I think the fairness and equity is going to be a big thing in the hybrid work model that's going to need to be a focus as we move forward. Similarly with, looking at, perceptions as well, and there's data, coming out of our ears really, but there's data coming out as well that says there's a perception that people that work remotely they're not as high performers as people who are visible in the office, and that promotions are generally given to people who have more visibility in the office. And so when we talk about fairness and equity, and we'll come up probably later in our conversation, that's something to also factor in, especially if you have diverse groups, women, from the US data set, people of color, in terms of more likely and prefer to work from home. If more are working from home, then there's that disadvantage. So I think fairness and equity is going to be a massive consideration in the hybrid model moving forward. Similarly with different leaders do different things, right? And so I think that that's a challenge for us in the HR space. So if we talk about, and you spoke about it, Matt, that this is going to become one of the things that we can attract people based on in terms of our flexibility of work. When we go into the talent war kind of space, how do you see that playing out?
Well, yeah, I just think it's a reflection of the fact that how people now view what's important to them from an employment perspective is very different. And the lens, I would say flexible work and remote is no longer a nice thing to have. It's a core expectation any employee has. Yeah. And so for those organisations that don't tap into that for whatever reasons, back to the original comment around this fairness and equity, the reality is you're not always going to appease everybody in an organisation because of the structure of an organisation. So, taking that into consideration, I think the demand for, depending on whether you're on the West Coast or the East Coast in Australia, they're kind of running at different trends based upon different circumstances around COVID. So that drives it from a national perspective very differently, from my experience. But I also think when you think about, I suppose, the types of opportunities that are out there now that maybe weren't around before, that just creates this bigger swell. And I know from my experience being in the market myself for 9 months last year, your expectations, unless you're actually in it, you don't realise just what it's like to be in it, even though I've been in HR for 20 years and get it from the other side. And it can be quite debilitating. So I think, and if the experience you have by trying to get a job is in that way, then that's a strong reflection on the organisation, what it might likely be. So I think when you take those considerations in and suppose that hybrid things, organisations have a clear mandate to actually look at some of the systems they set up to actually engage with talent. But the reality is everyone says they do it, but a lot of them actually don't. And I find that really conflicting where the value of time is spent in how they do attract. And I'd say that because there's a lot of opportunities, your ability to be quick in making decisions in maybe businesses where there's a lot of process and approvals, you're actually going to take yourself out the market pretty quickly. What roles we need now are more compared to what we needed 2 years ago are very different. Tech's a great example of just the demand, the unwavering demand in that space. Yeah. And it's only going to get more and more.
Yeah, and collaborative technologies are going to, not to blur into the skill space, but, the technologies we use is just driving a whole digital space as well. And I think, we talk about, or I talk about, like talent leaders and laggards and those people that organisations that are moving slowly, you're not close to the war on talent. Like, you are not even on the same page. It's hard when we have systems like the realist, though, in me, as a 20 plus year HR veteran, is that organisations have been built on systems, bureaucracy and everything in between, and trying to unpack that in clients that I've been working with over the last 2 years with COVID has been phenomenal. So trying to, free up that bureaucratic BS so that we can move with the agility that we need is not that easy. And when COVID first hit and it was crisis stations, red tape seemed to fall away. My experience is it's all come back and we've bound it with some black tape, some grey tape, every other tape we could find. Not everywhere, but in some organisations, the controls come back in. But, from a, historically it was the work from home policy, right? And there's lots of us that might still have, or organisations that still have a work from home policy. And the hybrid work and what we need to attract talent with is going to move far beyond that. It's gone from flexibility of location. It's now about flexibility of hours, as you talk about, Matt. There's then also, as we go into wellness type things, organisations are looking at a 32-hour week for same pay. Lots of different things that go with that based on the outputs-driven things that you were talking about, Marija. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens in that space. Marija and Hanri, do you have anything to add before we start looking at critical workforce skills?
I just think the whole industry needs to really do a mind shift alignment in terms of what really is the realities in the industry today and what they need to play with to maintain a competitive advantage, because it has shifted significantly from our traditional approach and what we've all pretty much grown up with across multiple years at the minute. So life's changing, and if you're not going to be able to shift your mind to be able to stay nimble and be agile, you definitely are going to lose any competitive edge that you might have had in the market.
And this is a point where you'll see that Matt's going to turn recruitment on its head. That's what's going to happen. And that's what part of his disruption is around looking at some of the work, right, in terms of how we get back to candidates, just that candidate care type aspect. You know, you've lost candidates by the time that, by the time you get to offer, they've gone, right? And so where do you see the critical skills kind of as we're moving forward? What are your observations, Marija? Do you have in terms of the critical skills type space?
I think for us, and I always try and promote the will over skill. Mm-hmm. So if somebody's got the will to learn, you can teach the skill. Mm-hmm. There are some skills that, come naturally to a lot of people, and there are some skills that don't. And I think, when you look at emotional intelligence, for example, and compassion and care, especially for our sector, they're really, really important. And they're the skills that we want to try and, extrapolate when we're interviewing people and when people are applying for the roles that we have. There are areas where, some skills in terms of qualifications are required because, we are governed by a body and we have to have a particular qual to be able to do that. Doesn't mean you can do the job well. The issue for us is finding that balance between the will and the skill. And I look at, leading with empathy, and I look at the compassion, and I look at, the motivational drivers behind why they want to come and work for us. And yes, you can have the best of systems and turnaround time and nabbing a candidate, but the chances are that candidates are applied for multiple positions already, and it's first in, best dressed. And my view of recruitment in general in terms of the skill, it's about pushing out what purpose and what is that purpose. And if you can find somebody that aligns to that purpose and values, then the skill can come later on.
It's a massive mandate, though, isn't it, to get hiring managers to think similarly around the fact you can't give people personality transplants, but you can teach them skills. And so that cultural fit kind of thing, it's a different hiring process. It's a different skills-based training process. It's just different. What about you, Hanri?
For us, the challenge really lies, if you look at the pace of change and the disruption across markets and industries, the need for different skills and how much faster that's actually becoming evident. I think the World Economic Forum predicted in an article I read recently that by 2025, pretty much maybe 50% of your workforce would need to be reskilled to remain relevant for the future. And it's where the organizations are really putting in and investing the time in doing that strategic workforce planning to really determine what those skills are that we need going forward, and backtracking the timeline and in terms of looking at how do you match that to the most effective sourcing strategy. Are these skills actually even going to be available in the market, or do they need to be grown and to start in time with that process? Because it's evident, it's out there. We don't have the skills today that we're going to need in the future. So it's about really identifying them strategically and proactively so that you can start the work in time.
And I think some of the, workforce planning lends towards that, right? But a lot of traditional strategic workforce planning and then operational workforce planning, again, this robust kind of engine of work that a lot of the time can take too long, and the forecast is looking too long. I read a similar report that the 50% of roles would require changing, but then another one that talked about 30% of skills in job descriptions that were in job descriptions in 2018, 2019. So 30% would then be redundant by 2025.
Yeah.
And so there's a massive gap, right? So as HR leaders, it's a challenge to try and get visibility on what is going on here, like what, and therein lies the imperative around being close and aligned with the business and operational leaders in our business to understand what's happening on the ground and the changes to the work and the fact of restructuring the work to do it differently, because we can't attract people. And so one of the things from trying to keep our people and optimize our workforce comes into then the employee wellbeing space that we're going to have a chat around, and that resilience to be able to cope with all this change in terms of the structure of jobs, how we need people to do their jobs. What about where we're sitting in terms of your observations around mental health, employee wellbeing, resilience? What are you seeing out there, Matt?
Well, there's like it goes back to that flexibility. I mean, wellbeing's another one where it's a must-have. It's no longer a nice thing to have. And again, I think it's an important function or important offering for employees within a workplace, considering what we've gone through. What I'd also say, though, is that sometimes the parameters of that are actually can get a bit muddy. I think sometimes we go too much around offering all these things that potentially aren't the things that ideally are actually needed to be delivered to help support mental health, well-being, and to some degree resilience. So I'd say from my experience, sometimes we try and tick boxes in this space as opposed to understanding what do we really need to help support the well-being of our employees, to not just around doing their job, but around supporting them outside their workplace, because ultimately what happens outside the workplace has a direct impact around how I feel and engage and collaborate and speak and engage within a workplace. So I think there's definitely been a much stronger investment in organisations to understand the importance of it. I think sometimes what's actually being offered might not necessarily be the things that are actually going to deliver the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And I think the resilience piece is a really interesting one, because the reality is some people can be very resilient, but it's that ongoing energy to continually be resilient. Mm-hmm. And, if you think about change, we do quite a bit of work where, you're doing that. There's a lot of change. If you're not aware of, again, being close to the business and understanding impact of change to employees, because they're receiving 5 different messages or 5 different changes in regards to they have to do something differently, they understand why they're doing it, just adds that further burden. So I think, sometimes organisations don't actually put the practices in place to actually mitigate it. And then create the problem, and then we try and rectify the problem, and then we miss the mark. So I think, look, when it's done really, really well, and I've seen some organisations do it really, really well, it actually is seen as actually something that people engage with, rather than seem like it's something they should engage with. It's more proactive, authentic, from my experience.
And I think it's going to grow. So it is that thing of, we had this whole perks thing, right, where mental health was like table tennis tables or billiard tables or something. But the employee health space has grown a lot. We've started with physical health, and now there's a focus and broadening that to mental health. I'm seeing some really emerging trends in terms of financial health, and employees really seeking support around financial well-being, which then lends to security. There's some organisations that are really innovating in this space and leaning into measures of employee health to replace employee satisfaction or engagement measures, because it's seen as a truer prediction of retention and performance. Because the healthier you are, the more productive you can be. And so it'll be interesting to see as that gets more traction, and as we have more kind of guidance around best practice in that space. I haven't seen some really great case studies as yet where organisations are really smashing it in terms of the 3 health balances and how that would be measured, how it would become a predictor of performance. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in that space. We know that flows into the diversity, equity and inclusion. I talk a lot to anyone that'll listen around building cultures of belonging. But there's different things that we're seeing. And I mentioned earlier that hybrid work without intervention could actually further disadvantage minority groups in our organisations potentially. I know you've got a passion for women in leadership, for example, Hanri, and different things in that space. What are some of your thoughts in terms of the DEI space and where we need to focus effort this year?
I think for me, the most important thing around DEI in general is that it's authentically more than just a brand promise, and where employees and aspirational employees, minority groups, whoever it is, actually really have that experience of inclusivity and creating a sense of belonging in the organization. I think a lot of organizations put a big effort into getting the strategy right and landing the brand promise and articulating it really well, but in how we then actually applying those initiatives and integrating it throughout the organization so that it just becomes the way we do things here, as opposed to this is a specific D&I initiative. And for International Women's Day, this is the run sheet of what we'll be focusing on. But how do we really contextualize that and weave it into the way that we do things? So I think that's where we're still missing the point. We've got our wraps and our plans and strategic efforts and list of initiatives, but have we integrated it into that absolute employee experience? Because that's what people are after. That they want to be able to feel they belong naturally, not because it's a specific initiative for this week.
Yeah. What do you think, Matt?
You know, I'm pretty passionate in this space, so I'll try and contain it. Well, I think, you know, it's such a significant and polarizing facet of an organisation in the sense that, you know, you sometimes work in industries where you're never going to change it. And, you know, you've got to be mindful of the impact of that, I suppose, from a workforce and what that means for an organisation, attracting, retaining, et cetera, et cetera. I think organisations try and do the best they can with what they've got as well, which I think is fantastic. There's an effort made. The reality, you can't be everything to everybody as well. So, you know, it's about where in your business, like in my case, previous roles, women in diversity, women and LGBT were key areas where we knew we had a point where, and a demographic that we needed to actually really step into because of the industries we represented. It wasn't an easy challenge, but the risk is, though, then you then isolate that you're not focusing on other areas of the business around diversity, whether it's diversity of thought, whether it's disability or, you know, other areas. And I think that's the challenge for organisations because there's such a focus on it. And I think for me, if you can actually focus on inclusion, inclusion drives belonging, inclusion drives diversity, inclusion drives equity. And I think that sometimes you can have a diverse workforce, but if they don't feel a sense of belonging or a sense of feeling like they're part of something, then you're just ticking your box at the end of the day. And you go back to the whole, and if you go back to that whole talent thing, people want a sense of belonging. One reason why I was attracted to CommBank around their stance around D&I, and they actually seem to live, like from what I've seen so far, they actually live it. So that was a driver, putting aside all those other metrics that I was potentially looking for in my role. So I think I'll be controversial in the sense that I think sometimes we actually contradict ourselves a little bit, though, as well. And I'm an LGBT person myself, happily married, husband of 20 years. But I think sometimes we forget that when we sometimes communicate within messages within our organisations, we actually isolate. So, good example. I don't have kids and, you know, love kids, don't get me wrong. But when I see a lot of messages that sometimes talk about families, it actually isolates me around the focus, even though that's not the intent and not that it can be everything. But then it's around, if there's no other messages or conversation around the other parts of our stance around inclusive and diverse strategy, then it actually isolates rather than engages. And that's a simple example of how that can play out. So I think it's having your lens on it from so many different angles is really important.
I think that's interesting because that comes up a lot as well when I do culture work and you get feedback for people, you know, that might be having fertility issues and then can't have families. And then you've got organisations that are driving return to work type things. And there's sometimes the challenge for us in HR, and this is where it's about calling out how hard it can be sometimes, right? We get challenged a lot of the time on being insensitive to certain groups. We can't be all things to all people, but we're expected to be. And at the same time, so we have this conflict where we're in the middle of trying to balance all of that, but plus have meaning and purpose to what we're trying to do. And I think it is that authenticity. And I think growth and getting our language wrong around sexual orientation, having our language wrong around First Nations people or, you know, different things is a growth type space. But a lot of it, I think, is if you have a constructive culture and people leaning in and you're coming from an authentic place, then there's more tolerance for learning and more tolerance then for, you know, acknowledging the effort. And I think if we can emulate that from a leadership level and a HR level, that'd go a long way from shifting us away from this quota type stuff.
Trina, I think you raised one of the most probably important phrases you've said is the culture of learning. And I think that is just super important because you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
And if you've always thought one way and you haven't, challenged yourself to think differently, then you're always going to think that way, never going to change. So it is about promoting the whole information, learning, communication, expanding what you know and challenging what you think is the right, and I'll put that in inverted commas, way of doing things, and being open to going, you know what, I'm not right.
Yeah, and I think that there's something that we need to be able to kind of take away from that, to look at how we engage the diversity within our workforce to help us with those, as opposed to sitting there and trying to do it even though it feels really hard. It's because if we don't have that diversity in our relationships, personally or professionally, if we don't have that exposure culturally in our travel or our interactions, if we don't have that knowledge in our learning, you don't know what you don't know. So you have to surround yourself with people that do know and proactively build the relationships authentically, to Hanri's point, where those people are going to want to help you learn, not just for the sake of it. And I think part of it, we want to move away from that quota type space, and we know that there's a big shift in terms of workforce data and analytics and the digital landscapes changing. Do you have any observations around what that's going to mean for HR this year, team? An ever-growing demand for data-driven decision-making, when often we may be in organisations where our systems don't have the best data or might preclude us from bringing together the wisdom that we would like to present to board or executive. What are your observations? Where would you focus effort in this area, if anywhere? Just open it up.
Oh, it's like a can of worms.
Yes.
Everywhere, everything. I think with data, you have to have a bit of an idea of what it is that you want to achieve, and then go and find the data that helps you get there in a way. Obviously, there's your raw data in terms of your metrics, your number of employees, FTE, female, male, other, etc. Right? So there's your baseline data that you need. If you want to drive change and you know where you are and where you want to get to, what is the data that you need? Having the right systems in place. Having a system that can actually do data for you. Great. Do we want to change the world? Yes. Will data help? Absolutely. It's just, what do you need?
Yeah. What do you think, Hanri?
I think for me, the opportunity for HR really is to get ahead of the game. I think in general and traditionally, we've brought the data at the back end of the process. I would love for HR to have human capital analytics available that feeds into business decision making at the front end of the process and not necessarily at the back end, because I think it would inevitably enable better business decisions. But historically and traditionally, HR is brought in after they've made all their plans, will come in instead of really taking that data and analytics into consideration while we're making the decisions and setting up the strategy and planning. So that's the shift that I'd really like to see HR take a challenge up on, is really being proactive and making that analytics around human capital available, because it's very empowering. But we pretty much still, in some instances, stuck in that support role, as opposed to seeing HR as enabling business decisions and business objective setting and achieving.
Yeah, because I think that there's a few elements to that, right? Like coming earlier into the process with our data requires us to have that credibility and influence already with our executive leadership. And so there's a whole piece of work, as you all know, that we do through the HR breakthrough experience and different things around how you level up in terms of the relationships to then be a part of the really critical business conversations. I still see in a lot of the work I'm doing with HR teams and HR leadership, us sitting in our lane of people, workforce demographics and people data that doesn't link to business outcomes. So I'm still working with a lot of organisations where in the HR space, we're not as across commercially being able to tell the story to our execs and leadership around this data is going to be a predictor of this profit or this revenue or this saving, especially in the not-for-profit sector. That's massive in terms of where our efficiencies might come from. So I think there's a lot in there from a data space that I feel like I have a lot of HR people saying to me that they're out of their depth in this space. And I don't blame them, because I think that there's a whole range of new things. And like anything, it's probably going to lead into our last trend as well. But I think with anything, in terms of the role of HR, a lot of the time we can be expected to be specialists in about 12 different areas, right? And we've all come through different streams. Some people have worked as generalists, some people have only worked in a specialism. And so there's an upskill that needs to happen to be able to have a credible conversation in this space. Yep. What are your observations collectively of kind of where the HR role is changing before we open up to questions?
I think the need has changed to not just have somebody that's just a generalist or just a specialist. I think we need strongly T-shaped HR employees where you've got a holistic view and deep understanding of a broad spectrum, and really developing, you've referred to, Trina, that true commercial business understanding, so that you can contextualize the HR data or knowledge or processes so that it makes sense for business and is easily integrated and aligned to where the organizational strategy is going. I think we can't just be the traditional HR anymore. You really need to bring more to the party so that you can get that credibility to have a seat around the table, because having a seat around the table is not to just sit and listen, it's actually be actively part of business planning and be seen as a true partner and part of business and not a support leg to business.
Yeah, because I feel like HR is at the crossroads again, where, you know, we've either got an opportunity firstly to be stepping into a space where we are fully across business strategy, where we are able to have much wider scope and add more to the business. I'm seeing a lot in terms of a shift to HR, potentially stepping more into the corporate social responsibility space, which is interesting. I haven't seen a lot in Australia around exploring that as a trend. And then the third one, which we've been fighting my whole career, and potentially you too, is around, do we just outsource HR because it's purely transactional? No, not if we're game changers in our space of trying to shift the needle. But there's some parts where maybe we should be automating. And I feel like we are holding on to potentially transactional activity to defend our worth and value out of fear of stepping into the space of really kind of where we can have impact in a business. And that's a scary space to be. I know with clients I'm working with in masterminds and the coaching and that kind of thing, it's a leap, but you don't leap without building the relationships first. You don't leap without kind of having that growth space. What about for you, Matt, in terms of future growth areas or focus areas or change in the HR generally?
Yeah, I think you touched on a really good point. I mean, any business is going through ways of being more efficient and more productive. So automation definitely comes into that place, and there's reasons why people don't want to go into it. Like, it's too hard, don't know where to start, protecting my job or my perceived value of worth. I think, you know, at the end of the day, automation is to actually drive or enable certain outcomes, but the work that we do in HR is all about the people interface, the human element. So it's striking that balance between what are the things you can do that doesn't require or it's repetitive, counterintuitive, unproductive, versus the things that you want to then say, well, the time we've then saved. And that's a great metric. I mean, much we talked about business, aligning it to business metrics. That's a great metric, just to talk about efficiencies that actually then obviously has value from an organisational perspective longer term in regards to how we work. I think you talked about the corporate social responsibility. That was something part of my remit when I was the GM People and Culture. And to me, that was like, you know, I looked after the internal culture from an organisation perspective, whereas the social responsibility function was more the external brand, you know, and how you interlink that helps build a great advocacy and a community engagement, I suppose, with your own workforce, who then become ambassadors and advocates out in the market around the good things that we do, which was quite challenging when you think about racing and gambling is not necessarily seen as good things happening out in a community. I think also too, just on touching on Hanri's point around being on the table, getting around the table, just being on the table doesn't necessarily guarantee you're going to have the ability to influence. And I sat at the table for 8 years, and it probably took me 4 years to build that level of advocacy and understanding of what HR can actually bring to not business. I think when we keep saying business partnering, it's almost like saying we're not business focused or not business driven. I think we're on the table like any equal around the table to drive outcomes that best support the business outcomes, whatever they happen to be, financial, tech, people, vice versa. And I think I just think it's something that from a HR perspective around what does it look like for, I think data analytics is an area where people have to start building more capacity and capability because it is a strong enabler to actually building advocacy from my experience. And so I think, the role of HR will change. And I think you'll see some really unique roles in HR that you're not used to seeing. Like my team at the moment is really different. I've got internal comms, I've got a change, I've got BAs, and because the reason that's going to, you're bringing unique skill sets that don't have to have HR background, but they're specialising in comms or change or, business improvements or business requirements. Actually, that creates a different blend around what you're able to deliver from a HR perspective. So I think we have to start thinking in different ways around what our team playing to strengths, but they don't have to be HR experts to be able to do that.
And I think there's, I've started to see discussion emerging around having a chief purpose officer, because you never like to come up with labels and new brands for everything, which I think is part of our challenge, right? I think we get, and some of you would have heard me say this before, we get lost in our own terminology so much that people wonder, what value do you add, because they don't understand what we do anymore. And that's part of our challenge as a HR profession. But I think this chief purpose officer kind of narrative is coming from this space of like trying to align the politics, culture, and the social debates. And so whether it's vaccinations, not sure if you've all been exposed to some of that mandatory vaccination type diversification that we're seeing in workforce. We've got the Black Lives Matter movement and some of the debate and expectation that organisations would take a stance. But what we have in every organisation where you have divergent views is then potential conflict. And so it's been interesting watching some of this chief purpose officer narrative come out, which they're saying that role would kind of have responsibility for, that essence of people being able to bring their whole self to work. So you come with your opinion, and it's a safe place to have it, and in building an inclusive and productive work environment. But I think that there's a lot of layers that can be added to things. And so I don't believe that there needs to be standalone roles for these kind of things. But in terms of the emerging HR space, I do think it's a void that I'm seeing where I feel like HR can be stepping into strategic conversations if we are the guides and provide guidance over culture. So I don't mean own the culture, so very deliberate around that, where I feel organisations, executives need to own culture, but it'll be interesting to see kind of what the expectation is in that space. Anything to add before we throw it open to questions?
Just wanted to touch on a couple of points that seem to be where I see sort of HR going, and that's whilst analytics and having a seat at the table, and I say that loosely, I think HR or people that work in the people space have a real unique view of the business, and we are in a very unique position where people talk to us about lots of things, and having the ability to connect the dots and adding that value is, I think, probably one of the most crucial skills that you can have as a HR professional, because that doesn't just speak to business, it speaks to people, it speaks to outcomes, it speaks to your people and your profits, and but being able to connect the dots. So it's that stakeholder engagement and really understanding who you're talking to, what is their value, what are they doing, how are they doing it, and understanding how it fits in the business, and then looking at who else is doing it and why aren't you two talking together. Really understanding how the dots fit. I think that's probably where we can add some significant value.
Yeah, and it's knowing where those change agents exist, right? So I talk a lot around HR and marketing needing to be besties.
Yeah, absolutely.
And looking at alignment because of employer brand, consumer brand, the employee experience, the consumer experience, that they're interconnected. And then there's different communication interaction tools we can learn from marketing. There's different kind of there's different disciplines that you can bring together that kind of support support the way we work. So for those that might be joining us live, I have a handy iPad here, which is, you might have been wondering why I keep looking down all the time. Not trying to cheat on notes, don't really have any. But if you do have questions that you want to put to us and explore further, I encourage you to jump in there. It's not in the chat, that you're going back and forward, letting us know around some previous difficulties but now fixed. But in the question section at the bottom, And for questions, if there are more questions that come through, we've got the next 20 minutes where we're going to be talking, about a few things. So if you've got any questions, please do put them in there and we'll look to answer them. One of the things that I'd flag, because someone asked me, but I posted the question because I couldn't be here live, was around, why I chose to focus on these 7 trends. And I just kind of want to respond to that because it was interesting, because I believe that fundamentally HR leaders and teams at the moment are in an overwhelmed space. Like, everyone I talk to is overwhelmed, under-resourced. There's trends and insights coming from everywhere. So, part of what we do is, like, I've been poring over Deloitte stuff, poring over Forbes, whether it's McKinsey, Harvard Business Review, all of the things that we follow really closely, and trying to look where there's trends globally. So I always have an issue with us just we've got people who are participating today from different parts of the world. And that's part of the joy I have around having this platform and being able to bring diversity in terms of some of the conversation, and different events will have different engagement kind of capability to them, and interaction. But it's this space around data that comes out of the US doesn't necessarily tell a story in Australia. And data that comes out of Australia, sometimes sample size wise, is not big enough to actually draw a trend from, and certainly wouldn't correlate potentially to colleagues that I work with in the UK. And so it's kind of, you look at all of it, and these 7 in particular comes out of my clients that I'm working with, the people that have come through my programs, the pain points that are kind of being experienced. But there's more, there's more kind of pressure points. And I don't know, maybe for the 3 of you, are there areas of focus that we haven't talked about that you think are big things facing you this year that haven't come up?
No, because I think those 7 things tend to cover a lot of what we're experiencing. And, we've spoken about workforce challenges and data and where HR's placed and how we do things. I think all the above, and then each topic gets beefed out so much more. And you can spend hours really talking about it. But I think the top 7 tend to cover pretty much where we're at.
Yeah. Okay. What about for the 2 of you?
I think the only other thing that really comes to mind, I agree with Marija, these are pretty much the top trending themes for us to work on. The only other thing that I have seen is where HR teams themselves are battling to really regroup and refocus around how they are approaching HR in the business. In many instances, HR's mandate is expanding. In some instances, you're adding a lot of the sustainability elements that I've heard come through also in some of the comments that Matt's made. So really just HR setting itself up for success for now and the future. It definitely has changed significantly from the traditional place that we've come. So how do we make sure that we are set up for future purpose and for success? And really finding a place that works for HR to group and regroup functionalities and scope in our delivery so that it remains really strategically relevant for the organization.
Every time Matt turns himself on his head, I really want him to say something like quite groundbreaking, but I'm not sure that now's the right time. So I'll throw to him in a minute and tease him live in a live.
Is that better now?
Yeah. Did you have any gaps, Matt, that are like burning platforms, for want of a better word? I hate that term actually, because it's like you don't want to jump from something in fear. You want to be attracted to something more positive.
I'd probably say I think it's a good capture of the key themes. 2 things I would say is around leadership competencies and expectations. I think it's one that is a pretty critical piece, because they're generally your biggest enablers for business strategy, business outcomes, people outcomes. And the other one I've seen is a bit of emerging is the way that HR works. And not talking about flexible work hours, but how you actually work. I'm going to say the word agile, and that sort of general methodology around how businesses or even teams are actually working differently is quite an interesting thing. So managing hybrid working teams with people in the office, agile ways of working has become a real interesting trend because it drives business outcomes around customer. So, you might have product teams and tech teams and those things doing those things, but now looking at other areas in the business like HR and corporate areas to go, well, how do we actually, as a team, work more iteratively and, not gold plate things and respond where the business needs are. So it's a more proactive approach around strategy rather than it being set and forget. So I think that one to me, I think is a bit on the radar from my perspective.
I think I'm having some challenges with the questions that are dropping off for me. I think that there's some elements around org design critically that would come up as well that we haven't touched on that I've just been reflecting on, and that is that I think talent management is going to move more towards skills than job roles. And I think part of the challenge for us in HR is all of our systems and lots of our structures are built around positions. They're built around position descriptions, which Matt's a massive advocate for not having. But so it's going to be tough to predict the future skills because in saying that means it's talent management is going to be harder if it's skills based and we don't have the crystal ball that we otherwise kind of might feel like we need. And then we're up against that change management fatigue, which has come up as a trend, right? So that's something that we kind of, need to look at. I know that there's a question that I could see on my iPad a second ago for you, Marija, and I can't see it anymore. So I'm not sure if it was deleted or whether it's just because of the refresh on my screen. But one that I'd seen on there was from Brianna around the role of CHROs in the future and in 2022 and key focus areas, I guess. And I think one thing I'd say around CHROs is that a lot of the time that level of role is positioned around its influence on a board and not just exec. So a CHRO role is typically a really big one globally. And we know, and I know in some data I've read that, it looks like pull data out of somewhere sometimes, but I can always share generally kind of where it's come from. So hit me up if there's things that you want to know more about in terms of sources. But, that 14% of boards or something feel like the CHRO is actually influencing decisions. And that's a bit telling in itself. But I think there's three kind of big elements that I see for CHROs, and they all kind of are underpinned by effectiveness. So effectiveness means getting outcomes. One's probably around workforce effectiveness. So we know we've had to navigate all the changing trends around increasing workforce resilience and improving employee experience and that kind of thing. So I think focus area will be around workforce effectiveness, how you maximize and improve employee experiences so people are delivering. The other arm would probably be personal effectiveness. So this is where we focus on the business driving activities where our leadership teams and boards need guidance. And I know for me, through our programs, that's where we spend most of our efforts in the personal effectiveness space. People come in, they know their craft. But in saying that, the third element would probably be functional effectiveness for me. And functional effectiveness is kind of, we need to be more dynamic. From a HR perspective, it's actually looking at our operating model and how we upskill capabilities such as agile, how we, and, Matt had mentioned kind of parts of that. So I think, being able to look at that is going to be really, really important. So a question from Helen. A lot of execs feel HR cannot be done remotely. How would you respond to that? Team -1?
I think.
Go on. Sorry, Hanri.
I just think we've adjusted exponentially. If we just reflect back on when everybody was in lockdown and half the world has spent so long in lockdown, I think with the right technology support and with the right mindset, I feel we've been able to seamlessly execute, even at a very practical and pragmatic HR business partner role, and provide that support to business on multiple dimensions and areas of business. So I actually would challenge that, because I think I've seen it in action where being remote or being hybrid or being online and dealing with something has been equally effective in resolving the problem. It's a mindset and attitude around, do you want to resolve this and figure it out? It's an interesting question though, because
and I think it probably lends to the culture of your organisation, right, in terms of a view of remote work generally. So the question was, Matt, you know, how do you respond to those that say HR can't be done remotely? So it's that traditional lens of people think your people have to be with the people. But the thing is, most of your people might be online. And so, and it's an important differentiator, though, from what Marija flagged earlier, different sectors. When we talk about hybrid work and remote work most of the time, they're what in the US they would call knowledge workers. I'm not sure how I feel about that terminology, but it's not our frontline workforce, right? It's our knowledge workforce and our advisory workforce more so. But I think for me, it would be embracing the collaborative technologies. Like, I think if that's an issue people are having with remote work generally, then that's where we've got an opportunity to lean in and try and show where the benefits from that will be for HR, the same as anywhere else.
I think one of the challenges, though, that we do have, and for example, in the office, we all wear face masks, apart from when I'm on my own. So when you're talking to someone, you're really trying to read their eyes and every other body expression. I think when you're doing it virtually or over the phone, there are some of those challenges that we as people, you know, we tend to be very good at reading body language, facial expressions, how, you know, actions and words sometimes don't align. So the challenge is to really listen to what somebody's actually saying, and it's the tone. So we're adding another skill set to our already broadening skills as people, and really sort of challenging how a person speaks and what is the tone, and does the tone match the intent? And that's a challenge. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of working from home. I prefer being around people, talking to people. And one of the biggest things that I think it builds that stakeholder engagement is face-to-face. Having said that, you know, the world is changing and we have to change and move with it. So, you know, how do we still create connection and meaningful connections in a digitized world? That's a challenge for us. And, you know, if anybody can do it, we can do it. It's just understanding where the gaps are and building on those.
Because I think that there's, you know, like if we automate tasks that managers are doing, for example, in theory, it's going to allow more time for them to invest in their human relationships, right? I think remote work is fundamentally underpinned by a proactive relationship management approach, and doesn't rely purely on going into a Zoom meeting to have a conversation around a work thing where you need an outcome, you don't stick to the agenda, and then that's not a relationship. That's the same with any other unproductive meeting that you might have in a meeting culture. So I think there's a lot in that. We've got a few other questions coming through. So Marija, during the discussion that's come up around fairness and equity between frontline workers and operational workforce and those that are based in corporate office, so support staff. So we'll throw to Marija, but I think it's a question for all of you. It's how do you manage to support fairness and equity and one culture when you do have segments of your workforce working so differently?
Really hard. So it's about what are those little things that you can do and support your managers in to understand why there's a disconnect between the fairness and equity, and what is the disconnect, and asking those real basic questions: who, what, why, not who, but what, why, and how. We do have pretty diverse workforce, and it is a challenge because there is also the fear factor. So it's fear in terms of COVID. I'll put it out there. So how do you manage the fear? How do you support that person in building their resilience? And I'll use that word. I don't like that word, but it's the word that seems to fit. I haven't come up with another one that seems to fit. And it's the understanding the why. So for me, you know, you've got your support office, which is your knowledge station, right? Which is what you mentioned before. And we tend to be the drivers that, you know, keep the business ticking along. And then you've got a portion of workers that are our doers, and they're really important, and it's making them feel important and valued, and really pushing that whatever they're doing, it's not forgotten. It's actually probably more front of mind than ever, especially now in terms of the care and the compassion that they give. And how do you bridge the gap? I think it's an involving challenge. It's something that you have to deal with day in, day out, time and time again. But it's also building those connections and building that safe space for them to be in and understanding the why.
Because I think for me as well, as part of culture, because most organisations have different areas of workforce, right? Some are more multidimensional than others. But I think there's been a lot of discussion around, well, how do we help you to work remotely? How do we help you to work hybrid? I think if anyone rocked up to an operational facility and said, how do we help you to do your job better? How do we help? I think that's where the fairness comes in. Yeah. I don't think people feel like it has to be same. But there are some segments of workforce, in my observation of work I'm doing with different clients in my consulting space, where we're not asking the people that are outside because they don't have the office issue. Yeah. It's like, but we need to talk to them around, you can guarantee they are being impacted in other ways, whether it's around fears of contracting COVID, if it's around, kind of how they're having to interact with community in terms of anywhere where there's a customer, there is now a changed interface thanks to the pandemic. So I think it's interesting. I do see that some organisations are focusing so much on the corporate model, and we're not actually going out and asking what others need to do their.
And I think that leads into that whole mental well-being. I think what Matt was talking about earlier, in that they don't want to know the perks. It's what can we do to make your job easier? What can we do to help you? And sometimes it can be really, really simple, but it's really important to ask those questions. Like, somebody might just be coming to work stressed out because there's no lid on a jug. Put a freaking lid on it. Like, just simple things like that. But if you don't know it,
don't tell them to put a lid on it. Oh, you mean the jug? Sorry.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you have any comments, Matt, to throw into that?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think with what Marija said, I think the challenge, I think where it always falls down is no communication. So that's the first piece. That's pretty simple. Like, we had that same environment in COVID where we had frontline people, the call centres that had to stay in the office and everyone was out. And I think what it came down to is also about role modelling. So I was very conscious as a GM going, hang on, if I can choose to be in the office and I'm okay with that, that's a good signal to send that, that they don't feel like they're isolated and they've got someone here, because I had the choice of coming in or not. It wasn't like I didn't have the call center had a very specific, they couldn't. So I think that's where some of the leadership has to come into it where possible and look beyond our own needs sometimes, because that helps placate and realise that you are in it together rather than thinking about my own self. I think, I think we overcomplicate it as well. So it is about very much around, in this day and age, it's about what's the best way we can support you to be your best in your role, to be engaged, and whether that includes how you work from an in-office or not an office, how do we support that, and making sure that there's consideration. It always flares up when it hasn't been considered or hasn't been communicated. And I use me as a great example. Like, we go back to the talent conversation. I wouldn't have been able to even apply for a role like this based upon the fact that we now have a different way we can work, and we don't have to be based in our office or based in a home that's based in the same location as where the head office is, like e.g. Sydney. So again, it's thinking it from a very different lens as well, and the fact that I've got teams over there where potentially we might have, I'm never going to be able to see them in the office because they're not in the same state as me, but doesn't mean we can't create the same sort of feeling around being in the office at the same time, being at home at the same time, to create a community sort of feel in how we work.
Yeah, and I feel like it's given us an opportunity. Like, I feel like COVID's given us an opportunity and a bit of a smack around the head, to be honest, around the fact that we'd become complacent in how we build relationships and how we build, teams. And so I feel like there's a real opportunity in that for us to harness, and I would hate for us to lose, as organisations, and some of that team spirit. It's wavered some of the things that we used to do during intense lockdowns, but if you have a remote hybrid workforce, it's going to need to be an ongoing kind of way of working. And I think, there'll be some interesting kind of changes coming up in that space. There's a question here from Helen around what's a HR game changer. And I do use that language a lot. And I've had people say to me, I don't think I'm a game changer, so I won't come to your event. So congratulations, you're all HR game changers for a start. But I think for me, it's about trying to create a new energy, right, around how we do HR. And I feel like, I've come from a space, and I've shared my story with some of you. And if anyone's been on my socials, around having found myself in a really toxic organizational culture. It made me doubt my kind of competence, capability. Stayed in it too long. You know, you put yourself in a different environment, situational context, which for me was a bit extreme. I moved to Cambodia. But, you know, and then you put yourself in a space where you actually really get focused on what's important and what you can improve. So I'm driven a lot by making a difference in the space. So for me, a HR game changer is an individual or a team or anyone that's wanting to significantly kind of change the way that things are done in HR. Like, I feel like we need to go to blank canvas for this stuff. I feel like we need to be, you know, thinking differently. And, you know, you'd be having to use your personality traits and your attitude to kind of bring some energy to spark that change. So, like, you know, if we turn up somewhere and say, oh, I really think that we might need to transform the way we recruit, no one's listening. No. And so I think, for me, it's just around that language is around anyone that has an energy to do things differently, I think can be a game changer. It's then putting yourself in a space where you can learn new approaches to HR, when you can, you know, explore different and expand thinking around agility and teamwork and innovation and productivity and how you link productivity to outcomes. So it's all about having an impact at the end of the day. But for me, I'm driven by wanting to create a community of game changers because I know how good it feels. And so I can't help but use that language and talk about it, because when you're in a space where you're having influence and when you're in a space where your experience is more positive, it's game changing for you personally. And I felt that shift. So that's the language that I carry through. But I don't know, what do you guys think of when I use the language HR game changer? What do you think of?
I think I resonate really well with how you've contextualized that. But for me personally, it's about having a platform where you can ask the tough questions, that you can start a conversation, because you innately feel that something's not lining up and it's not working as effectively as it did 10 years ago. But you often are a lone wolf crying, you know, singing your own solo song. So where do you get people that are like-minded that could then sort of, you know, ratify that and actually lead to conversation around how we potentially could do this differently, and how is it represented or manifesting, or how the trend's showing up in different industries, and how do we leverage that? We all have that same willingness and want to make it better and to help business succeed. And if you can feel that in your environment you're not being that optimal, it's really just starting the conversation around how can we do this differently? If it's value that we're aspiring to achieving to business, what does value look like today?
Yeah. And I love that I noticed you're using HR Game Changer on your LinkedIn, Hanri, and I love that. I can't tell you how much I love it. Because when you talked about your HR breakthrough experience being your HR breakthrough moment of 2021, it's like, I could see it. I could see the shift, and then you had the promotion and now you're in it's just, it's magic. I love it. What were you going to say, Marija?
I think for a HR Game Changer, everything that you and Hanri said nailed it. I think there's that precursor, because organizationally we can be game changers, right? And that's fantastic. And that comes with experience, it comes with time, it comes with, you know, building your networks, having a look at who's doing what, where, how, differently. I think there's a real need to change the study of HR. And I'm talking, you know, obviously degrees. You know, you go to uni, you do a commerce degree and you do it in HR management or otherwise. I think there's also that change in the theoretical, change in the thinking, change, promoting some of that critical thinking. And whether or not perhaps when you've done your degree, like I'm currently at the moment looking at further study. And when I did my degree almost 20 years ago, lots changed in that space. And it's educating yourself and it's promoting that constant learning to see what are the trends. What are the analytics telling us? What are we teaching the future workforce? What are we teaching the future game changers? And how are we promoting innovation and transformation and all those wonderful things to make businesses better? But that also comes down to a person's willingness to change and a person's willingness to speak up, but also personal development.
Yeah. Because I think that's alarmingly, by the way, some of those textbooks are still used. I
know.
And I think, and to that point, I think I'm an experiential learner. And so academically, it's not where I put all my energy. I put my energy into people, to relationships, hearing people's stories. And I learn from what other people have done. I'm thirsty to hear what they've done, to learn from their experiences. And that's why I'm really excited that that's going to flow into this space, actually, in terms of just sharing, lived and learned experiences. It's both. I still have a fundamental issue with tertiary qualifications being insisted on for HR roles when I know that experience trumps it every time. I'm not sure I've used my degree in my actual HR career, that I couldn't have replicated in another way with just some good supplementary study and good mentors. But I think that's the key, though, right? It's seeking out the networks and the people. So if you are someone that's wanting to do it differently, it's finding people that are also wanting to do it differently and creating that community. That brings us to the end of our panel discussion. Matt's not even here for me to thank him. So thank you, Hanri. Thank you, Marija. Thank you, Matt. You catch us on the watch live, so you hear the thank you. So I guess I might just take a couple of minutes to wrap up kind of the session. So thank you, team. Really appreciate your insights and sharing your experiences. So for me, in terms of wrapping up, kind of where we've come from and kind of what we've explored today, obviously, as I mentioned, there's a lot of noise out there, right? There's a lot of noise out there around what the trends are, what industry says we should be doing. We've got attention then around what executive teams, boards, our middle managers who have a whole heap of different views of what our role and our world is. And I think it's amazing that you could join us here today to just kind of lean in. I always said that this was the world according to us. And so this is us kind of sharing some of our, thoughts and observations. Thank you for coming, Game Changers. And we would love to see you back here again. We've got some really exciting speakers that are lining up. There will also be masterclasses. We're really looking to have conversations that matter to really help us shift how we are approaching our people practices. So thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks.